This is a fictional story inspired by Elvis Presley. Everyone in the room believed they were about to witness the easiest business deal in American history. By sunrise, they expected a young singer to become the property of the richest man in the state. They had already imagined tomorrow's headlines. The boy accepted the fortune. A star was purchased. Money won again. But they were wrong. Because before that unforgettable night was over, a fortune that could have changed generations would be rejected without hesitation. A room filled with the most powerful men in America would fall into absolute silence. And one sentence spoken by a young man from Mississippi would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The strangest part? The richest man in the room would discover that he was standing before the only person he could never afford. Outside, the storm had swallowed the city. Sheets of rain crashed against the towering windows of the Hawthorne Grand Hotel, each thunderclap shaking the crystal chandeliers that hung from the magnificent ceiling. Lightning briefly illuminated the skyline before darkness reclaimed it again. Inside the ballroom, it was another world. Golden chandeliers bathed everything in warm light. Walls covered with hand-carved oak reflected the glow of hundreds of candles. Rare paintings collected from Europe stretched across the room like silent witnesses. The marble floor shined so perfectly that every reflection looked like another world beneath people's feet. Expensive perfume floated through the air, the smell of imported cigars mixed with aged whiskey. Soft conversations drifted from one corner to another, while an orchestra quietly performed in the background. This wasn't simply a party. It was where fortunes were created, empires expanded, lives were purchased. And tonight, another dream would supposedly be bought. At least, that was what everyone believed. Near the center of the ballroom stood something almost impossible to ignore. A magnificent grand piano. Its body had been covered in polished gold. Its ivory keys glowed beneath the chandeliers like pearls. Guests had spent the entire evening admiring it, yet nobody noticed the young man quietly sitting before it. His black suit was clean but modest. His shoes had been polished so many times that tiny cracks had begun to appear in the leather. His blonde hair was carefully combed. His hands rested peacefully upon his knees. Those hands looked ordinary, but they carried years of sacrifice, years of factory work, years of playing tiny clubs where only a handful of strangers listened. Years of believing in impossible dreams while the world laughed. His name was Elvis Presley. He wasn't famous, not yet. There were no screaming crowds waiting outside, no flashing cameras, no luxury cars, no bodyguards. Only hope. Hope, and a promise he refused to break. Across the ballroom, the conversations suddenly stopped, one after another. Heads slowly turned toward the entrance. Someone whispered, "He's here." Even the orchestra quietly lowered its volume. Richard Hawthorne entered without saying a single word. He never needed an introduction. Power introduced him before he spoke. Tall, perfectly tailored charcoal suit, silver tie, black leather gloves, a walking cane carved from ebony, carried not because he needed it, but because it reminded everyone that he ruled every room he entered. Behind him followed lawyers, bankers, assistants, private security, people who had spent years obeying every command he ever gave. Richard Hawthorne wasn't simply wealthy. He owned railroads stretching across the country, luxury hotels, shipping companies, steel factories, banks, publishing houses. Entire neighborhoods had been built using his money. Entire newspapers survived because he allowed them to. People often joked that if Richard wanted a mountain removed, someone would begin digging before sunrise. He stopped in front of Elvis. The young singer slowly stood. The ballroom became silent enough to hear rain striking the glass. Richard studied him for several long moments, then smiled. "So, you are the boy everyone keeps talking about," Elvis answered politely. "I suppose I am." Richard circled him slowly, like a collector examining a rare object. "I've listened to your recordings. They're raw, unpolished. But people," he smiled, "they believe you." He stepped closer. "And belief sells." Several businessmen laughed quietly. Richard looked around the ballroom. "You know what I love about business?" Nobody answered. "Everything has a value." He looked back at Elvis. Land, gold, companies, politicians, newspapers. He paused. And people. A few guests smiled knowingly. One elderly investor quietly nodded. Richard snapped his fingers once. A leather briefcase was carried forward, then another, then another. Each one was placed carefully upon an enormous mahogany table beside the golden piano. Click, click, click. Metal locks opened together. The ballroom gasped. Stack after stack of freshly printed banknotes filled every case. Perfectly organized, perfectly counted. An amount so enormous that several guests instinctively stepped closer. Richard never looked away from Elvis. "Do you know what this is?" Elvis remained silent. Richard answered anyway. "Freedom." He reached into the final briefcase and removed an elegant contract sealed with dark blue wax. Heavy paper, perfect handwriting. Every legal detail already prepared. He gently placed it beside the mountain of cash. One finger rested upon the signature line. "One signature. That is all I ask." His voice remained calm. "Beginning tomorrow, you sing only for me. My theaters, my radio stations, my recording company, my tours, my audience. I will introduce your name to every corner of this country. Within a few years, you will become one of the richest entertainers America has ever seen. No more empty pockets, no more uncertainty, no more wondering whether your family can afford another meal. Everything changes. Tonight." The room erupted into quiet whispers. "He'll sign. Anyone would. Look at all that money. His life is about to change forever." One banker leaned toward another. The poor never refuse fortunes. Richard heard the whispers. They pleased him, because they confirmed what he had believed his entire life. Everyone, eventually, sold something. He looked into Elvis's eyes. "So tell me, what is your price?" The question hung in the air. Even the rain outside seemed quieter. Elvis didn't answer. Not immediately. Instead, his eyes slowly drifted toward the enormous windows. Lightning illuminated the storm. For just a heartbeat, he no longer saw the luxurious ballroom. He saw another storm, another night, another home. A tiny wooden house standing alone beneath the Mississippi rain. Water leaked through the roof. The wind slipped through cracks in the walls. There was almost no food, no heating, no certainty about tomorrow. Only faith. His mother sat beside a flickering oil lamp, carefully sewing a tear in his shirt for what felt like the 100th time. Her fingers were tired. Her smile wasn't. Young Elvis looked down at the table. There was only enough bread for one person. She quietly pushed it toward him. "I'm not hungry," she whispered. Even as a child, he knew she was lying. He pushed the bread back. "So am I." For a long moment, neither of them touched it. The storm outside grew louder. His mother finally spoke. "Do you hear that rain?" Elvis nodded. "One day, people will hear your voice the same way. They won't be able to ignore it." He laughed softly. "I'm just a poor boy." She gently placed her hand against his cheek. "No, you're a good boy. And never confuse those two things." She looked into his eyes with a seriousness he had never forgotten. "If God ever gives you success, promise me something." He nodded immediately. "Promise me your songs will never belong to the highest bidder. They must always belong to the people who need hope. They must belong to the lonely, the broken, the forgotten. Because once your heart belongs to money, it no longer belongs to your music." Young Elvis slowly wrapped his little finger around hers. "I promise, Mama. No matter how much they offer me, I'll never let anyone own my soul." Lightning flashed. The memory vanished. The ballroom returned. The storm still raged beyond the glass. The briefcases still overflowed with money. Richard Hawthorne still waited. Every guest stared at Elvis without blinking. Richard smiled one final time. "Well, has the storm inside your head passed?" Elvis slowly lifted his eyes. The quiet young man who had entered the ballroom was gone. Standing before Richard now was a son carrying a promise that no fortune could erase. He looked at the contract, then at the mountains of money, then directly into Richard Hawthorne's eyes. His lips finally began to move, and with the very first word he spoke, the atmosphere inside the ballroom changed forever. The silence inside the ballroom became so heavy, it felt impossible to breathe. No one reached for a glass. No one whispered. Even the orchestra had stopped playing. The only sound that remained was the relentless rain crashing against the towering windows, as if the storm itself had paused to hear what the young singer would say. Richard Hawthorne stood motionless, one hand resting on the polished mahogany table, the other lightly touching the edge of the contract. His confidence had never failed him before, not once. He had negotiated with presidents. He had bankrupted rivals twice his age. He had purchased newspapers that attacked him and transformed them into loyal supporters before the week was over. He had watched judges change their decisions after a single private meeting. He had built an empire by understanding one simple truth. Fear was stronger than loyalty. Money was stronger than fear. And greed was stronger than everything. That belief had made him one of the most powerful men in America. Tonight would be no different. At least, that was what he still believed. Richard smiled. It was calm, patient, the smile of a man who had never truly lost. "So," he said quietly, "you've had enough time to think." His voice echoed across the ballroom. "Every dream comes with a price." Tell me yours. Elvis lowered his eyes toward the contract once more. The paper was flawless. His name had already been written across the top in elegant black ink. Only one space remained empty. The signature. One stroke of a pen, one simple decision. One moment that could change everything. His fingers slowly reached toward the document. A ripple moved through the crowd. Several businessmen smiled. One woman quietly whispered, "I knew it." Another laughed beneath her breath. No poor man walks away from that. Richard watched without blinking. His heartbeat remained steady. Victory was only seconds away. Elvis picked up the contract. The thick paper felt strangely heavy in his hands, not because of its weight, because of what it demanded. He slowly turned the first page, then another, then another. The ballroom remained perfectly still. Finally, he stopped reading. Richard stepped closer. "Well?" Elvis looked up. "I have a question." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Only one? What happens after I sign?" A soft laugh spread across the room. Richard answered immediately. "You become successful." "I become yours?" Richard didn't hesitate. "For the length of the contract." "My voice?" "Mine. My concerts? Mine. My recordings? Mine. My future?" Richard smiled. "Also mine." A few guests chuckled. To them, it sounded like an ordinary business agreement. To Elvis, it sounded like chains. Richard leaned forward. "You'll still be rich. You'll still be admired. You'll still be loved. You simply won't have to make difficult decisions anymore. I'll make them for you." The sentence settled into the silence like cold steel. Elvis looked into Richard's eyes for several long seconds. Then he quietly asked, "And if someone needs me somewhere else?" Richard frowned. "What do you mean?" "If a small church asks me to sing for free. If a hospital asks me to comfort dying children. If a poor family cannot afford a ticket. If my mother wants me home. Do I ask your permission?" The smile slowly disappeared from Richard's face. "This is business." Elvis nodded. "I know." Richard folded his hands behind his back. "Business built this country?" "No," Elvis answered softly. "People built this country." A murmur spread across the ballroom. The atmosphere changed. The businessmen who had laughed only moments earlier now watched carefully. Something unexpected was happening. Richard's voice became colder. "You still don't understand. I am offering you everything." Elvis shook his head. "No. You're offering me everything that can be counted." Richard's eyes narrowed. "What does that mean?" "It means..." Elvis paused. "Some things become worthless the moment you put a price on them." Silence. Absolute silence. For the first time that evening, Richard Hawthorne had no immediate answer. His jaw tightened. Then he laughed, slowly, coldly. "You remind me of myself. When I was young, I also believed principles mattered. They don't. They disappear the first time life becomes difficult." He took another step closer. "Tell me, when your family is hungry, can principles buy bread? When the roof leaks, can integrity stop the rain? When hospitals send bills, can dignity pay them? Each question struck like a hammer. Many people nodded. Richard wasn't entirely wrong. Reality was cruel. Dreams didn't always feed families. Elvis remained silent. Richard saw hesitation, or at least, he thought he did. He smiled again. I knew we'd eventually understand each other. He gestured toward the money. Go ahead. Take it. Nobody will judge you. The ballroom waited. Elvis slowly walked toward the open briefcases. Mountains of cash lay before him. More money than he had ever seen in one place. He reached out. His fingertips hovered only inches above the neatly stacked bills. The room held its breath. Richard smiled wider. This was the moment. He had seen it thousands of times. Everyone hesitated. Everyone resisted. Everyone surrendered. Always. Elvis finally touched the money. Just for a second. Then, he closed the briefcase. Not gently, firmly. The metallic click echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot. Richard's smile disappeared. Elvis looked around the room. He studied every face. The wealthy, the powerful, the influential. Then he spoke quietly. When I was a little boy, my mother once gave me half of her dinner. I ate it. Years later, I discovered she hadn't eaten anything for 2 days. The ballroom became completely still. She never told me. She only smiled. That smile is worth more than everything inside these briefcases. Richard stared at him without speaking. Elvis continued. You believe every person has a price. My mother believed every person has a purpose. I've spent my whole life deciding which lesson to follow. He gently placed the unopened contract back onto the table. I made my decision a long time ago. Richard's voice was now barely above a whisper. Think carefully. If you leave tonight, you may never receive another opportunity like this. Elvis looked directly into his eyes. If becoming successful requires me to stop being myself, then it isn't success. No one moved. No one even seemed to breathe. The storm outside exploded with another deafening crash of thunder. Lightning filled the ballroom with blinding white light. For one brief second, every face froze like a photograph. Richard Hawthorne realized something that had never happened before. He wasn't negotiating anymore. He was losing. But powerful men rarely accepted defeat, especially not in front of an audience. His expression hardened. His voice became dangerously calm. If money won't move you, perhaps fear will. The room instantly fell colder. Several guests exchanged nervous glances. Even Richard's own assistants looked uncomfortable. Elvis didn't answer. He simply stood there, waiting. Richard slowly removed a fountain pen from his jacket. He placed it beside the contract. Then he leaned forward until only inches separated them. You still have one final chance. Sign, or walk out that door with nothing. Elvis looked at the pen, then at the contract, then at the storm raging beyond the windows. Finally, he smiled. Not with confidence, not with arrogance, but with complete peace. And that smile frightened Richard Hawthorne far more than anger ever could. because for the first time in his life, he was standing before a man who had already decided what mattered most. And men like that could never be controlled. The smile on Elvis's face lingered for only a moment. Yet in that single moment, Richard Hawthorne felt something he had not experienced in decades. Uncertainty. It was unfamiliar, uncomfortable, dangerous. Throughout his entire life, every negotiation had ended the same way. People always reached for the money, sometimes immediately, sometimes after an hour, sometimes after a night of pretending to resist. But eventually, everyone surrendered. Everyone except the young man standing before him. The ballroom remained frozen. Outside, the storm roared louder than ever, as if the heavens themselves refused to remain silent. Lightning flashed across the sky. For an instant, the enormous windows became mirrors. Richard saw his own reflection, an old man surrounded by unimaginable wealth, standing before a young man who owned almost nothing, yet somehow looked richer. Richard clenched his jaw. "You've made a mistake." His voice was low, cold, measured. "You think history remembers men with principles. It doesn't. History remembers winners." Elvis didn't answer. He simply walked toward the magnificent golden piano. Every eye followed him. His footsteps echoed across the marble floor. Slow, steady, certain. He sat down without a word. His fingertips hovered above the ivory keys. The ballroom held its breath. Richard frowned. "What are you doing?" Elvis looked up. "I never learned how to argue with men like you." A quiet pause. "So I'll let my heart speak instead." Then, his fingers touched the piano. The first note drifted into the room like a whisper, soft, fragile, almost too quiet to hear. No one moved. Another note followed, then another. The melody slowly grew, filling every corner of the ballroom. It wasn't loud, it wasn't complicated. It was honest. And honesty has a sound that no amount of money can imitate. The orchestra instinctively lowered their instruments. No conductor gave the order. They simply knew this moment belonged to someone else. Elvis closed his eyes. Then he began to sing. Not to impress, not to perform, not to become famous. He sang the way a son remembers his mother. He sang about empty tables that somehow still felt warm because love sat beside them. He sang about worn-out shoes that carried dreams farther than polished boots ever could. He sang about nights when hunger had been real, but hope had been stronger. He sang about ordinary people whose names would never appear in newspapers, yet whose kindness quietly changed the world. His voice carried no anger, no bitterness, only truth. As the final verse rose through the ballroom, something extraordinary happened. One of the waiters quietly removed his white gloves and wiped away tears. A young violinist lowered her head because she could no longer see through the tears in her eyes. One of Richard's own bodyguards looked away, ashamed that a song had reached him where fear never could. Even the businessmen who had spent their lives calculating profit sat perfectly still. Some remembered mothers they had buried. Others remembered promises they had broken. For a few precious minutes, nobody cared about wealth. Nobody cared about contracts. Nobody cared about power. They remembered they were human. The final note slowly faded into silence. No one applauded. Not because the performance was weak, but because it had left the room speechless. Richard Hawthorne stared at Elvis. His hands rested on the cane so tightly that his knuckles have turned white. He wanted to speak. No words came. Finally, he picked up the contract. He held it toward Elvis. His voice had changed. For the first time that evening, there was no pride inside it. Name your price. The sentence echoed through the ballroom. Everyone waited. Elvis stood. He slowly walked toward Richard, toward the money, toward the contract, toward the future every person in that room believed he should choose. Richard extended the pen. Elvis accepted it. A wave of whispers spread through the ballroom. I knew it. Everyone signs. It was only a matter of time. Richard smiled. Victory. At last. Elvis looked down at the contract. His name was beautifully written across the top. The blank line waited. The pen rested in his hand. Instead of signing, he folded the contract once, then again. Richard frowned. What are you doing? Without saying a word, Elvis slowly tore the paper in half. The sound seemed impossibly loud. Rip! The room froze. Then he tore the pieces again, and again, until the expensive contract became nothing more than tiny white fragments drifting through the air, like snow. The pieces landed across the polished marble floor, across the stacks of money, across Richard's polished shoes. No one breathed. Richard stood motionless. His eyes followed the falling paper. Years of certainty, reduced to scraps. Elvis gently placed the pen back on the table. Then he looked at the mountains of cash. Without touching a single dollar, he stepped around them, toward the exit. Each footstep echoed through the silent ballroom. When he reached the enormous doors, he stopped. Without turning around, he spoke one final time. You can buy a stage. You can buy lights. You can buy advertisements. You can even buy applause. A long silence followed. But you will never buy the reason people clap. He opened the doors. Cold, rain-filled air swept into the ballroom. Before disappearing into the storm, he added quietly, Love is earned. It is never purchased. The doors closed behind him. No one moved. No one spoke. Richard Hawthorne remained standing exactly where Elvis had left him. His assistants waited for orders. None came. Minutes passed. The storm outside slowly began to fade. Richard looked around the ballroom. He saw the faces of people who had witnessed something no amount of wealth could erase. For the first time in his life, he understood the difference between owning success and deserving respect. Slowly, very slowly, Richard bent down. He picked up one tiny piece of the torn contract from the floor. He stared at it for a long time. Then, without caring who was watching, he lowered himself onto one knee. Not before Elvis. Elvis was already gone. He knelt before the truth he had spent his entire life denying. That some things are greater than money. Some promises are stronger than fear. Some people cannot be bought. Years passed. Richard Hawthorne accumulated even greater wealth. His companies expanded, his fortune multiplied. Yet time did what money never could. It quietly erased his name from people's memories. But the young man who walked away from unimaginable wealth never disappeared. His songs crossed oceans. His voice reached generations yet unborn. Children learned his name. Parents shared his music. Grandparents smiled when his melodies returned.
Not because he had chosen fortune, but because he had chosen freedom. Because on one storm-filled night, when the world offered him everything it believed mattered, he protected the only thing that truly did: his soul. And history whispered a lesson that echoes far beyond that ballroom. Money may build a legacy of wealth, but only character can build a legacy that outlives time.